Welcome to Original vs. Reboot, the show where we take reboots and remakes and compare them to their original film. Today we're going to be taking a look at the 1933 version of King Kong and compare it to the Peter Jackson 2005 reboot of King Kong. In the original, the role of Ann Darrow was played by Fay Wray, and in the reboot, she was played by Naomi Watts. The role of Carl Denham was played by Robert Armstrong in 1933 and Jack Black in 2005. And the role of Driscoll was played by Bruce Cabot in 1933 and Adrian Brody in 2005. And of course, both films star King Kong. The original, as I say, made in 1933. Filmmaking with sound was only getting going then. Obviously by 2005, special effects had come on a long way, especially when you're Peter Jackson and you have the budgets he has and you come fresh off Lord of the Rings and you have that whole team working on it too. Now the runtime on both films is the main difference in these two movies. That's two movies. The Peter Jackson reboot is a whopping 3 hours and 7 minutes long. And the original is 1 hour and 45 minutes long with no credits. So clearly there's some big difference between the two movies, but the point of this show is to compare the two and see which is better. And when you watch both movies, especially back to back, it's very clear that Peter Jackson took a lot from the original and kept it in there, paying homage to the original in a lot of places. But there's a lot of differences too. Obviously there's a 1976 version of King Kong as well, which stars Jeff Bridges. But in my research for this episode, I discovered that most people actually hate that version for some reason. So maybe there's a whole different video on that one coming soon at some point in the future. Not now. Back to this one. So in both films, as I say, the story is very similar all the way through. It begins with Carl Denham looking for an actress to fill in a role because his main actress has left. They're trying to get away on a ship. They're going to an unknown island that no one knows about apart from Carl Denham. Even the crew don't know. And ultimately they end up at Skull Island. But the interesting thing in the original is that they weren't going to Skull Island. They were going to an unnamed island which had a mountain named Skull Mountain. Maybe it was in the 76 version. It happened where they changed it to Skull Island. And obviously more recently there's been Kong Skull Island that's come out. So they've clearly changed the lore there. But in the original, it was just an unnamed island, Skull Mountain. Getting to the reboot, the thing with Peter Jackson films that I don't understand is why do they all have to be 3 hours long? Like, I'm all for telling a good story and creating a world and getting everybody invested in your story, but it shouldn't take 3 hours long. The opening of these two films are very different because in the reboot, they very much focus the first hour on Jack Black and his role of trying to get the money to make his film, that he's trying to gather everyone together and he has to go find an actress, and ultimately about an hour in they end up setting sail for Skull Island. In the reboot it's only about 30 minutes until they actually set sail. There's a big pacing difference in the two films, with the original going much faster. It very much seems that Peter Jackson split his film into the 3 separate hours. The first hour doing the establishing of everything, the second hour on Skull Island where we find Kong. At the end of the second hour, they capture Kong, and the last hour in New York. Peter Jackson version, undoubtedly, visually spectacular. Looks far better in places, because the Peter Jackson version does have some weirdness about it. The scene on Skull Island where they find the tribe, and the tribe attacked them, which doesn't happen in the original. Well, at least not initially. In the Peter Jackson version, in the scene with the tribe, it's like they tried to do slow motion, but they hadn't recorded at a high enough frame rate. So they just end up with this stop motion-y type of weird, hard to watch scene. The main story across the two is very similar in a lot of places. But one thing Peter Jackson tried to add in, maybe it was in the 76 version, I haven't actually watched the 76 version, so maybe that's where they added it in and he just took it from that. But in Peter Jackson's version, Ann Darrow's relationship with King Kong is explored much more, and she ends up having more of an interest in him and kind of forming a relationship with him, an emotional relationship. They have a connection, they focus on building up that connection, and ultimately when Kong is captured, Ann's really upset. And ultimately at the end when he's killed, spoilers, she's really upset. But in the original, Ann Darrow is terrified of Kong all the way through. So when they're on Skull Island, Ann Darrow's been taken by Kong. In both films it's the same, she's been taken by Kong. The ship crew and the film crew, they're all looking for Ann Darrow, and ultimately they start traveling through Skull Island and realize it's kind of a land of the lost. There's dinosaurs and all sorts of weird creatures. In the original, they're very much stop motion creatures which look really weird. Ultimately, they establish all these creatures. which ends up somehow with Kong fighting a T-Rex. But in the original, Kong fights one T-Rex. In the reboot, he fights 4 T-Rexes. But ultimately finishes it by crushing the T-Rex's skull down and playing with his jaw, posing as he does with all the things. But there's various parts in this with other dinosaurs where the crew are running away from dinosaurs. At times it almost felt like Peter Jackson was pitching to make a Jurassic Park film. He was like, look, I can make a dinosaur movie, because there's scenes where it just seems like he forgot what movie he was making and decided to add in a dinosaur chasing scene. Like there's this whole scene where there's a stampede of dinosaurs chasing after the film crew. It didn't add anything to the story. I guess it was a good visual, but it was completely unnecessary. It was just adding in things for the sake of adding in. And it's one of the problems with Peter Jackson's film. The pacing is just way off. It's very, very slow. In the original as well, Kong fights a lot more things. He fights a T-Rex, he fights a giant snake, he fights a pterodactyl. And every time Kong defeats something, he plays with it afterwards. Something that they kept in the 2005 version. Because when he fights a T-Rex in the 2005 version, he kills him, he snaps his jaw open, and he just plays with his jaw and he kind of poses. He does that in the original too, but he does it with everything. Like when he kills a snake, he kind of throws it around. With the pterodactyl, he rips him open and does this thing again and poses. A lot of the stop motion in the original led for some very funny looking scenes and weird facial expressions on Kong, and it really takes you out of it. But obviously for the time, the special effects were good for the time. In retrospect, it looked pretty bad. I'm sure in 100 years time, when people are looking back at films that are made nowadays, they'll be laughing at how bad the CGI was. Unless they see Sharknado and they go, wow, it's amazing. Another weird scene in the original one that isn't in the reboot is a scene where Kong has Ann Darrow and she's kind of knocked out in his hand. She's just holding him and he starts stripping off parts of her clothing, but just rags kind of. And then he's tickling her and the music emphasizes that, and then he like smells his finger for some reason. Yeah, that happened. In 1933, they were really only getting going with filmmaking. So the whole acting for camera, performing in front of camera, was relatively new. And that's very evident, especially at the beginning of the film, where a lot of the actors end up tripping over each other with their lines. Some of the line delivery is very poor. The acting overall is very weak. Obviously, it's not a problem they had in 2005. Naomi Watts, Adrian Brody, and Jack Black are all phenomenal. The big problem with the 2005 version is the pacing. At 3 hours and 7 minutes long, it's a long, long movie. Before doing this episode, I rewatched the movie and I split it up over various days. It actually took me 4 days to get through it because the movie was so slow paced. I just couldn't hold my attention for the whole time, whereas I sat through the original, no problem, hour 40 minutes, whizzed by. In the reboot, a weird part is when Kong gets Ann Darrow for the first time. He's running through the jungle and he's whipping her around as he's running. He'd surely snap her neck, but I guess you gotta apply movie logic there that, nah, everything's fine. In both movies, we ultimately get to a point where Kong is about to be captured, but it comes about in a different way. In the 2005 version, it's very much Carl Darrow's plan to capture Kong. He establishes fairly early that that's what they're going to do. That Driscoll is going to lure Kong back and they're going to be ready at the tribe's camp to capture Kong. They've brought gas bombs and everything. They're just going to throw chloroform bombs and take him down. In the original, Denham only decides this at the last minute when he sees Kong is chasing after them, but obviously they just happen to have gas bombs around. In the original, the tribes people are still there too. They're still in the little village thing. And when Kong comes along, it's kind of like a horror film, I guess, that they were trying to do, where Kong just goes crazy and starts killing everybody, especially tribes people. He's biting off their heads, he's stomping them into the ground, he's destroying their houses. In the reboot, that's not the case. They're ready and waiting for Kong, and when he comes through the walls, they're instantly throwing bombs at him, they're instantly trying to take him down, and ultimately fail, and Kong escapes. But then, Kong is constantly trying to go after Ann Darrow. Ultimately, Kong is trying to get to Ann Darrow. He won't give up his pursuit. And it ends with Denham throwing one final bomb into Kong's face, and that's what takes him down in the reboot. In the original, it is Denham again, the only one to throw a bomb, and it's one bomb takes him down. They capture him, they head back to New York. In both films, when Kong's been taken down, Denham proclaims, "We're going to be millionaires, boys." and he tells all the guys he's going to share the money with them, and Kong's name's going to be up in lights on Broadway, eighth wonder of the world. So we cut in both films to New York. We see people flooding into theatres, everybody congratulating Denham, everybody excited, but one big difference in the 2005 version, Ann Darrow isn't there. She's gone off and done her own show thing. She's gotten a job somewhere else. She didn't want to be involved with it. In the original, Ann Darrow is very much there with Driscoll and Denham, waiting for the show to begin. So Ann Darrow's character takes a different path in both films. Obviously, in both films, Kong escapes. It's very much different at this point in the two films, because when Kong escapes in the reboot, he's going looking for Ann Darrow. He doesn't know where she is. He's just going to go out to New York and find her, I guess. It actually leads to a pretty funny scene where Kong's outside the theatre and he's just picking up any blonde woman he can find, and if it's not Ann Darrow, he just throws her away. So, if you're a blonde woman in New York at that time, unlucky. Ultimately, in the reboot, Driscoll ends up in a car facing Kong, and Kong recognizes him and chases after him in the car, and Driscoll leads Kong to where Ann Darrow is. In the original, Ann Darrow goes off with Driscoll to their apartment, I guess, and we see Kong climbing a building, and he finds a woman. He sees a woman through a window, and he reaches into her apartment, grabs her out of the apartment, holds her upside down, realizes it's not Ann Darrow, and just lets her drop from the building. He's kind of an asshole. And ultimately he ends up at the right apartment, and he takes Ann Darrow out and starts climbing a building. In Peter Jackson's version, the 2005 version, Kong has Ann Darrow now, and he starts climbing buildings and ultimately climbing the Empire State Building. We see all of that. In the original, they just cut to a police station, and we hear over the radio, Kong is now climbing the Empire State Building. And then ultimately they show him at near the top, climbing the final little bit in a very wide shot, and the plane's coming in, and it's very poorly established, I guess, but it is 1933. Their special effects weren't as good. Peter Jackson's version definitely looks more spectacular at this point. And both films from this point on, very similar. It ends up where Kong ultimately is shot down by the planes, falls off the building, and Darrow's upset. And then we see Kong dead on the street. Carl Denham comes through the crowd and ultimately tells a police officer
It was building on the bridge.
And both films end. So there's a lot of similarities between the two, a lot of differences between the two. The main one being the runtime. Now with King Kong, there's not a whole lot you can do. It's a fairly basic story. They find the giant ape, they capture him, they bring him to New York. He terrorizes New York, finding a woman, and then climbs a building and is ultimately shot down. There's not too much you can add to that. Yet Peter Jackson managed to add an hour and 20 minutes to it. So ultimately, after all of that, we get down to which film is better. And it's a tough call, because obviously the original has become so iconic and spawned multiple reboots, multiple remakes, and they're still making them now. As I said, Kong Skull Island came out not too long ago, and that's arguably the best Kong film so far. It created an iconic character. The reboot definitely looks much, much better, and the acting is far superior. I think Jack Black was unfortunate that one of his best performances was just in a boring film. It's a shame that the film just wasn't a little bit better, because the film, it looks good, it sounds good, the story's okay, but it's just so long, and it doesn't do enough to keep your attention. The original, you know, they do their best. It's funny when it shouldn't be funny, but what it has is its pacing and its storytelling is fairly good once you get over the dodgy acting and the dodgy stop motion. The story's pretty good, it's well told, and the time whizzes by when you're watching it. It's arguably the toughest call we've had so far on original versus reboot. Let me know what you think in the comments below. The 1933 version or the 2005 version, which do you think's better? Ultimately for me, it has to boil down to, if somebody said to me, which movie would I enjoy watching the most, I would have to tell them the 1933 original, only because they'll fall asleep watching the reboot. And it's a huge shame, because the reboot, as I said many times, it looks really good. It's got a good version of King Kong, it's got some great actors in it, some great acting, it's got all the elements it needs. It was just dragged out far too much. It could definitely be edited down, by about an hour. You could take an hour out of that film and it'd be fantastic. They added in characters that weren't needed, like Colin Hanks is in this movie, in a role that nobody needed. And the other guy from something, who I always recognize but never remember his name, he's in it too. He's playing an actor in it. And again, unnecessary. Now, maybe you think I'm wrong. Maybe you think the 2005 version is one of the best films ever made. If you do think that, you're kidding yourself. But if you do think that, let me know in the comments below. Now, there is another problem with King Kong. It has to be asked about all the King Kong films, well, apart from Skull Island. But the whole thing with the original King Kong film and the other reboots of that is that he steals a woman, or he kidnaps a woman, a normal sized woman, a human sized woman, and he's this giant ape. What was he planning on doing with her? Obviously in the original he starts taking clothes off and tickling her. That intimates what he was going to do. But it raises the question. King Kong, big King Kong, tiny woman. How would that work? Unless King Kong, tiny dong. That bombshell. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you're new, for new content every Wednesday and more recently Fridays. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you next time.